Right, because you got to start this thing.
After folks, Julie Q and Patrick McMurray. We also have some oyster farmers and distributors here from Canada, especially for you back at house. You'll meet them later on when we start shucking. We have Atlantic Aqua Farms, we have Ocean from Fortune Oysters, we have James Powers from Raspberry Oysters, and our friends here, and Bobby's here from Atlantic Aqua Farms, Lisa's here from Aqua Farms, and Jose is over here, and my wonderful assistant Heather is over here helping me from Canada. Jose Valdez is the one that we always bring because of very excited oyster shucking competition kind of guy too. So thank you again for coming. What you can experience today, we're going to take you through a presentation of Mr. Masterclass. I'm going to give you a short presentation, very short, about oysters. And then we're going to have a little panel discussion with some folks that are here. So you can ask questions, any question you want. It's going to be very informative. Amazing appreciation, so I know you will. And then we're going to go over there to get right into it. But if you do that, they're cutting, going to serve you on the half shell, East Coast and West. And then you're going to have two baked oysters. To explain that as well. So without further ado, thank you very much again for coming and the Institute Culinary Education having us back. And I will have you listen to press.
Atlantic Canada. Our oceans, lakes, rivers, bays, coves offer a treasure chest and robust garden for growing oysters. They grow far and wide and reared, living and breathing in the cold, pristine waters, full of nutrients that are embedded in the Atlantic Canadian waters. The experience is truly like kissing the sea. Known for their consistent, high quality and freshness, each province, each region dictates an oyster's unique flavor. Processing oysters always meet international quality assurance standards, ensuring you receive a healthy, safe, and supreme product every time. Our farmers, they live and breathe what their families have passed along for centuries. Food is the heart of Atlantic Canadian culture. Their world is your oyster. From the highest tides in the world to the red sand soil, the rocks and seaweed walls of kelp, it all contributes to our Atlantic Canadian terroir. Today, we are excited to spoil you with a host of Canadian oysters. From New Brunswick, the classic Beaujolais oyster. From Nova Scotia, Fortune oysters from the north and Dion oysters from the south. From Prince Edward Island, you feast on Raspberry Point oysters, Barstow oysters, Colville Bay, Caskenpeck Bay, Northern Bells, and the Petite Bargeois. So get ready to sip and savor with a new oyster appreciation, because every oyster has a story, and we can't wait to tell you about it.
Right on. Welcome, welcome. My name is Patrick McMurray. This is Julie Chu. We are both co-founders in creating this idea and concept of an Oyster Master Guild, which is paralleling the sommelier world in wine or beer, Cicerone or whiskeys. Oysters can parallel that. We talk about the different species of oysters, different regions, and we come out with appellations, much like you do have appellations in wines and whatnot as well. So we're going to start off with a masterclass is what we're talking about.
Mini masterclass.
Mini
We we don't really want to get between you and your oysters. I know that's why everybody's really here. But like to Patrick's point, we came up with this program because we realized that chefs and shuckers are really the front lines of oyster appreciation in the grand scheme of things. There's a lot of people who are enjoying oysters at home, but the majority of them are enjoying them at raw bars and events. And we wanted to put together something that can help those types of professionals give the best experience possible. Because if you can imagine, there's a lot of people who probably say, oh my God, I don't like oysters, or oh, I think they're gross. They probably just had a bad oyster, and it's probably not the oyster's fault. It was probably badly shucked or something else. It wasn't properly handled. So the reason why we care so much about this is to equip everybody with the knowledge and skills to give the best experiences ever for their customers or themselves and friends and family.
How many people here actually like oysters?
Yes.
Anyone not like oysters that are here? You guys can sit outside. Okay, we'll feed you some ham and cheese sandwiches too. But you'll find that when people get into them, have you tried oysters before? Is it a textural thing, or is it what is it? A lot of times it's going to be something like that. It's a textural thing. It could be something you don't quite understand. But as time and time again, if you learn from someone who can explain it to you, what you're going to experience, I've seen more often than not that people actually make it to the dark side like the rest of us. And it's kind of a neat little thing. If we talk about it the way we're going to talk about it today, hopefully you'll be inspired to try oysters. This is not something, this is why we're doing this, because you don't learn this in school. I teach up in Toronto now at Centennial College, culinary and hospitality, and oyster is not something you learn, generally speaking, in colleges like this. It's something that at this level, it's apprenticed. We professional oyster shuckers just start shucking and we learn along the way. Come on in, there's lots of space. The last one, though, karaoke, you have to sing a Post Malone song. Because he's got a Post Malone sweater on. I figure he's going to sing us a song now too. So go ahead. This is why it's interesting for us to teach this, because I never got taught this. This is a self-taught thing. And so we're just developing it now and producing it so that everyone can learn a lot more about oysters.
Actually, that makes a point. Can you give a quick intro about your experience?
Oh, right.
With oysters.
I am Patrick McMurray, world champion, Guinness Book of World Records oyster shucker. That means I'm pretty good.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough. No, a little more. No, I'm just kidding. I have a degree in kinesiology, which is a weird thing to be and then transfer into the food world. I've always loved the food world. My first job was a butcher's apprentice. Sweep him up, get this, sawdust on the floor back in those days. So I swept up on the Friday, Saturdays. I would work the deli counter and they taught me about butchery, which is cool. And I thought the restaurant side would be really interesting to get into as well. So with my kinesiology degree, strangely enough, I made this thing. This is my oyster knife. You may have seen it. I probably not, because they're very weird looking, but it's got a pistol grip shape. It allows you to open up oysters easier than regular oyster knives. And there's a science behind it. But with all of that as well, I've built 2 restaurants from scratch, Starfish and the Cayley Cottage. Starfish was my oyster bar up in Toronto, and it was fresh fish for 15 years from 2000 to 2015. And then and I built it from scratch, like taking a building, renovating it, the whole works, and bringing it right up. And then my Irish bar. My Irish bar, Cayley Cottage, I learned that oysters can go into pub menus and something that's a little more downscale. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a high-end restaurant or a bistro. It could be just about any place. Oysters have those different levels. They go well with beers, wines, champagnes. So we kind of think of it in that sense as well. What can the oyster go with and where can we put it in this business? So long story short, now I'm teaching, and I teach things like entrepreneurship and sustainability, and of course, food theory, level 1 for everyone as well. And the graduate courses, which are 8-hour classes on weekends. Nobody wants to go there because I can talk for 8 hours. but I'm trying,
You
I'm
actually
trying. Julie's
could.
going to cut me off every so often.
Yeah, I will.
That's me. And Julie Chu, and I wrote a little book about oysters. You're going to introduce yourself?
Yes.
Or shall I introduce you the way you introduced me to yourself to me? What was it, 2010,
It's okay.
2012? No, later?
So I actually met Patrick, 10 years ago, and I was initially an oyster consumer, oyster lover. I started a blog called In a Half Shell in like 2009, and that kind of led me around the world to visit a lot of different oyster farms, meeting a lot of oyster distributors and people who just know a lot about the topic. And then I kind of realized for a while after that, that the value that was being produced on those farms and in those habitats was not being transferred to, at the raw bar. And so after, kind of celebrating oyster culture, I really endeavored to help produce those types of events for others. And then Patrick and I have been talking about oyster masquerade for literally 7 or 8 years, and we're very, very excited to bring this to you. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And like I just mentioned, oysters are actually available all around the world. This is Patrick's map. Each dot represents an oyster farm, and there's probably many, many dots you don't see. And you'll probably notice that almost every continent has at least one oyster farm. And yes, there is one in the Middle East. If you notice that, it is very cool. It's part of the UAE in Fujairah Bay, and fantastic project that's been going on for like 6 years. And so what's really unique about oysters is that once you get into it, you unlock this really crazy world of oyster lovers from wherever you want to travel. So if you love to travel, being an oyster fanatic is also a really good connection point there. And of course, we're in North America, so our level 1 program focuses on North American oysters, but the ambition will be to focus on other oyster regions like Europe and Australia. And I know a lot of people are probably talking about food trends nowadays, especially in a culinary context. So oysters are the OG food trend. So the earliest documented consumption of shellfish was 164,000 years ago. They found shells in a South African cave. And there's evidence of a lot of oyster and clam consumption around the coast. And in fact, some research even suggests that those civilizations who started out on the coast were able to consume shellfish, which has incredibly high amount of omega-3s, helps with their brain development, right? And that actually was one of the building blocks to more sophisticated societies. So eating oysters is really good for you. Romans, of course, are really known well for their love of oysters and other gourmet foods. The picture on the top right is actually a rendering of what a original oyster farm in Roman times was. This was in the South Iberian Peninsula, which is now modern day Cadiz. But they were known for cultivating, bringing oysters from one location, kind of putting it in another, finishing them up, and then bringing them to market. The other picture here is an oyster midden. If you have a chance to go visit any historic oyster middens, it's kind of just a pile of shells, but it's really cool to know that there's like literally millions and billions of shells that were created by indigenous peoples, for peoples who really, subsided on this protein. And today we are very lucky in North America to be able to experience oysters in a number of ways. And I think over the last 30 years, 40 years, we've seen oysters being taken from a commodity viewpoint into a very branded experience. And so instead of having just maybe 2 or 3 oysters available on your menu, you now have, we just showed like 8 or 9 logos, right, of different oysters from different farms. And I think that is also telling because for us, for food people, we want to know where our food comes from. And so now the relationship that people can have with their oysters is very different. You can know who grows your oysters or who's harvesting them as well. And with that, I think as oyster consumers and people who handle oysters, there's going to be an evolution too. We're already seeing it. We have observed that there is a dramatic difference between an untrained oyster eater and an oyster sommelier. We're just coining the term just to make it simple for everybody to understand that is someone with understanding of where their oyster comes from, how it's produced, impacts of seasonality. And that is going to be in their heads when they're eating oyster. So you can tell whether or not it's a good oyster, whether or not it's worth the money that you're paying for it. And being able to tell that story actually gives you much more value in your experience.
When we're showcasing oysters, a lot of times, especially when you have an oyster bar, you get whatever the wholesaler can get for you, but you can also strive to look for it. You look for oysters that have different flavors and different texture structures so that you can describe them to the clients and customers in a light that they would understand. And they would end up understanding those different brands that they like, and they come in and ask for them by name. So if you can get to that level and understand it and showcase and tell the people to enjoy their first oyster without any sauce or lemon on it at all, and then they get that true taste of the ocean. It's one of those exciting things that you can actually showcase the fewest ingredients ever on a food dish that you're going to serve, and people will taste it and enjoy it. And this is part of the 5 species.
Right. So one of the first things that we get into in North America, we are very fortunate to have access to 5 species of oysters. Typically around the world, they're only dealing with 2, maximum 3. And so because we are able to, it's kind of a hodgepodge of native oysters and imported oysters, starting from the left side, our native Atlantic oyster, the Chrysostrea virginica. All East Coast oysters are of 1 species. So think of a grape, and that they can, depending on where you have that grape, you can have different types of the styles of wine, right? Similar with oysters, the virginica species is grown up and down the East Coast, but it translates into different varietal names, depending on who's growing it, where it's grown. Pacific oysters came to the US around 1920s from Japan, the Western Asian Pacific coast. Kumamoto's as well, this tiny thing grows, it takes forever to grow, but it's very lovely. And then you have the Australia, the edulus, the European native oyster, as well as the Lorida, the Olympia oyster, which is native to the Pacific coast of North America. And this guy was pretty much decimated during the gold rush, and people are trying to restore it now. And there's a little bit of volume on the East Coast. We really don't see it all that much because they don't travel very well. But so if you do find it on a menu, it's actually worth trying out. Patrick can attest to the fact that they're very, very complex in flavor despite their little size.
We have this arranged in a picture format of complexity. So it tends to be most complex over here, least complex over here in ascending order. So you can actually take oysters and create flights of species, singular species to multiple species in arrangement in complexity and flavor on the palate. And when you see that and taste that on their own, it's a fantastic thing. And we're going to be doing that today. Mm-hmm. We have a East Coast and a West Coast oyster that we're going to show you. Both, of course, this is the Canadian Cafe. It's British Columbia. And we'll figure out what the East Coast oyster is that we're going to show you as well when we get to that point. You have to know your anatomy, strangely enough. And with a kinesiology degree, yay, I can finally use it by understanding that the anatomy of the oyster actually, if you understand it, you can actually read the shell and know how to open it better. And then you can have that fun stuff of showing customers what they're actually eating. And they'll either go, I need the bill, please, or they'll go on and enjoy it like the rest of us.
The few things to know about the oyster anatomy. This is a picture of an Eastern oyster where the top shell is just taken off. It's kind of upside down right here, but you typically will have a hinge at the very top. This is the pointiest end of the oyster. This is also where you would go and shuck through the hinge if you are going that way. And then traveling down to the gills. The gills are what helps the oyster breathe and also filter their food from the water. So oysters are vegetarians, I would say, and they eat phytoplankton from the water column. They're actually quite picky about the food that they intake. So from a very small percentage, they can sort out what they want to eat and what they don't. The mantle is along the gills. This is a part that helps them grow extra shell on the outside. So using calcium carbonate in the water, they're able to construct the shells in layers. The bill is what we call the front end of the flat side of the shell, and that is also an entry point For those of you who didn't realize, there's 3 entry points on an oyster. So the hinge, the bill, and the side. And depending on the oyster and the shucker and where they're from, you will find different people entering the oyster in different locations. What else? The adductor muscle, that muscle, the white muscle kind of towards the center, but it's really, if your hinge is pointing to you, it's really always on the right-hand side. That is the muscle that keeps the 2 shells closed. So what is the difference between abductor and adductor, everyone? Is abductor.
Abductor takes away, and adductor brings them together. Again, kinesiology. With your legs, you have abduction on the outside, adduction on the inside. So the adductor muscle on the shell brings the 2 shells together, the top and the bottom, or the right and left valve. The hinge has an elastic property to it. It wants to stay open all the time. So when the water is in, tide is in, under the ocean, the oyster does not expend any energy filtering the food and doing its little oyster business. The tide goes out, boom, closes up tight, very tight. And the button or the muscle is actually like a scallop. That's usually a good descriptor if you're trying to explain to people what's that chewy part within the oyster. Well, it's like eating a scallop, same type of structure. It is a muscle structure that holds the shells together so that when the tide goes out, it can be exposed for a number of hours. How many hours is the tide? The fisherman? 6-ish? Okay, cool. So you can hold its breath for 6 hours. What differentiates us on the East Coast cold water areas is that we deal with ice a lot, and in the Canadian weather, so they have to hold on to that shell and then hibernate. Once they hit that fridge, they get into a hibernative state. So we'll talk about that in a second as well. But it does have a heart valve just behind the adductor muscle, that spot right there, and a stomach. Yes, as they all do, if you're going to put the food somewhere, it has to digest that food. So when you're opening up an oyster, if you happen to poke the stomach, which is at the back, it's like a muscle. When you cook mussels, there's a green stuff on the inside. That's algae. That's phytoplankton. That's what the mussels are feeding on. Same thing in this oyster here. So it's usually a lovely shade of beige. 50 shades of beige is usually what oysters are. And once if you cut the back of it, you're going to see this color. And I've had some customers ask me, what's the red stuff or the brown or the stuff there? I go, it's algae, seaweed. It's what the oysters is eating. And they just concentrate it in the stomach so they can digest it over time.
So as oyster professionals, when you are shucking or bringing in oysters in, I think everybody or skilled oyster, som, and shucker will do these 5, or kind of evaluate the quality using all 5 senses. And it almost is second nature. You don't even think about it, but we wanted to break it down of how you use all 5 senses to get, to kind of gauge the freshness of your product.
When you get oysters in, first thing you're going to do is see. The eyes eat first. Yes, we've all learned that 500 times, I'm sure. So you're looking at the shell. You read the shell. As a shucker, I read the shell to understand how I'm going to open the oyster. That's a couple levels up. So once you get to understand, you can see the quality of how the oyster's been growing. Are they all consistent? Do they look the same? Wild oysters don't look the same. They have inconsistency, but well farm-raised oysters are constructed in a way that they all have a nice even teardrop shape and easier to open. So that's why our lovely farmers spend 4 to 5 years growing oysters to make the market size so that we can create something that we can open very well. So we look at the quality of the shell on the outside. We also look at the quality of the meat structure on the inside. We have things like meat to shell ratio. We want to see how fat and plump the meat is compared to the actual shell. As a consumer, you want to see something that is lovely, fat and plump. Our oysters also go through 4 seasons, so we can talk about that as well. And from spring, summer, winter, fall, there's going to be different textures that's going to be on the oyster as well. Listening, when you open up a box of oysters, you're going to cut the strap to save the tag. Tags go into a thing. You got to know by the tag. It has to keep hold of it for 90 days. It's a food thing. So when you open it up, you listen. You can toss the oysters around. So when before I put them out on the oyster bed, and this is what for our chefs in the house, toss it around. You're going to hear they should all sound solid when they're bumping against each other. If something sounds like a little castanet or hollow, keep your ears open, keep your nose open next, because that might be an oyster that's opened up, might be a little off, and so you can remove it if it smells off. Which is the next one? No, touch. Oh yeah, feeling it. Yeah, you'll be feeling the oyster as well. When you pick the oysters up out of the box, fresh out, they should feel heavier than they look. There is a density to a lovely fresh oyster, full and plump with a lovely meat. So you want to feel that oyster. And it also, technically, you should have a moisture to the outside. Oysters should not be stored on ice. They should be stored just in the fridge in the box that they get shipped in. And or when you put them in the fridge or going to use them overnight, you want to cover them with a wet towel. So a kitchen towel. Get it wet, keeps the moisture in and the humidity in the actual oyster, and you don't want the oyster shell to dry out. So those are things that I look for quality. Then the smell, because all oysters should smell like what? Nice, the ocean, the sea, fresh things, happy smells. Seaweed, you know, walking on the beach with the sunset and the rainbow and the bare feet. That's what it's, no, not bare feet. That's what it smells like, not bare feet. Smells like the ocean. Unhappy smells, fermented leaves, rotten eggs, something's gone awry. So you have to find that oyster. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you just can find it, rinse everything else off, and then go and use the rest of the oysters. But be aware that there might be something else you want to look into that, into the box. So keep your eyes open. And then finally, taste. So when you taste the oyster, we use all senses again. We have a specific way that we like to showcase in tasting our oysters. When you were told to have oysters, what were you told that you texture-wise? Did anyone tell you something specific when you were eating your oyster? Yep. Did they eat it or did they shoot it back, swallow it? Yeah, so some people tell you just hold your nose, swallow it. You know, and I when I see people come up and I tell them, I go, no, 2-bite chew. You want to chew? No, you don't chew your oyster. I've always been told to just swallow it. I like, do you do that with all of your other food? What did your mother tell you to do when you were eating food at the beginning of life? To chew your food. Thank you. Chew your oyster as well, please, and thank you. Because then you really get the flavor. 2-bite chew and you aerate. So aeration.
You're jumping ahead.
We're jumping ahead?
Yeah.
It's just tasting. So you're going to find the flavors and the taste in the oyster when using the full 5 senses. How to taste oysters.
Yes. So how to tasting oysters. This is obviously not something you do with every oyster, but to kind of understand the structure and the flavor and the finish of the oyster. It's very much like wine in that you first look, see, smell, similar steps to evaluating quality. But once the oyster is open, you want to judge the shuck, right? Because if it's poorly shucked, what does it look like? Probably nothing appetizing. There's probably, it just isn't, it's just not very pretty and appetizing that way. Smelling oyster, sipping the oyster liqueur. So the oyster liqueur or liquor is the little bit of liquid that should be in the oyster when it's still fresh. If it's very dry, it means it's just been out of the water for too long. Not to say it's unsafe to consume, but it just doesn't really taste great if it's, you know, you have to just chew it and the texture's off. That's better for just saved for cooking, if you want to do that. Savoring, chewing, 2-bite chew, and then aerating, what Patrick was just saying, was to sip in a little bit of air. Like wine, you aerate and you breathe out through your nose. So that actually creates more sensations on your palate because the amino acids in, or the protein in the oysters is interacting with your saliva, and the amino acid in that oyster is creating sweetness on your palate. And it's also giving you a lot more nuance when you chew and aerate than if you would just like chewing a little bit and swallowing. And then finally, our ritual that we like to do, and as people do, is flipping the shell over on your platter once you're finished, because if you have an array of different oysters, you will soon quickly see that all the shells are unique. And it's very telling about where the oyster is coming from and how much freaking hard work the farmer puts into every single oyster. What else? And then take notes. I guess since you showed your knife, I'm going to show my little tasting journal.
Yay.
This is something that I developed to take notes about oysters. And it's a bit nerdy, but I like to do it for the same oyster over different seasons, because you will definitely notice that the oyster holds on to some baseline characteristics that's signature to its location, but then it will taste sweeter or a little bit more metallic sometimes, depending on which season you're in, or it's an easy way to track your favorite varieties. So what are you actually tasting when you are tasting an oyster?
Cocktail sauce.
That's a negative.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, please leave. We actually have observed that the oyster is unique in that it actually has the potential to hold all 5 key tastes. And every single component in the oyster has its own contribution to that taste. the salinity from the oyster liquor, the seawater that's been filtered in the oyster. The sweetness is coming from the adductor muscle and stored glycogen in the bellies, especially during winter time and when it's cold, when you'll taste it later. Fat actually has a bit of an acidity, but typically you add in the acidity with a little drop of lemon. I think that helps balance it out. Bitterness can come from the mantle on certain species and certain times of the year. The minerals in that oyster will give a little metallicness sometimes, a little minerality. Some people say it's like licking a rock. I don't know how many people have licked a rock in their lives, but that's what I imagine it would taste like. And then finally, my favorite, umami, the deliciousness, right? And that is when oysters are brought out of the water, they're in your fridge for a few days. What happens? It's like dry aged steak. The proteins in that meat break down a little bit and they create amazing, amazing deliciousness in the oyster. So I personally like my oysters several days out of the water, not like immediately fresh. It's just me.
It's a total different experience with your feet are in the water and James is bringing the oysters to you. Thanks, James.
Yeah.
And eating the oysters while you're in the water. It's a complete, even in the
Totally
middle of
different.
summer, warm water, the whole works. It's a different flavor when you have them sit in the fridge or transferred to Toronto. Takes a few days.
Right.
They change and they have these interesting flavors and nuances with the whole thing that way.
And also this actually, if you can see that if all components of the oyster contribute to a complete taste, then this is also why shucking matters a great deal, because a lot of times when you're shucking incorrectly, you take off the adductor muscle, you take off the top of the oyster, what are you doing? You're removing some of that flavor and characteristic of the oyster from the experience. It also looks terrible on the left side, right? Who wants to eat that? On the right side is a pretty good example of different oyster species well shucked. So Patrick is going to get into it once he does a shucking demo of what a well shucked oyster should look like. And there's something in between, which is where a good majority of people are at right now. But we always try and challenge people to say, look, if you want to give and get the best oyster experience, you want to be here, not over there.
There's some oysters that will, when they're perfectly shucked, there's a tension on the and texture to the actual meat, to the point of I've found a meaty bite, toothfulness. And then it's sort of like a water chestnut where it's got that firm bite and then it kind of disappears. When it's shucked poorly, you don't have that experience as well. So you want to give the oyster, the folks grow it for 4 or 5 years. You want to, don't shuck it up in 5 seconds, make it look good.
Don't shuck it up. That's our motto, by the way. Don't shuck it up. Okay, a few more, you guys. So I don't know if you noticed in the video, it coined the term merroir. Merroir is taken from the wine culture, or terroir, but merroir is what people like to say is the taste of the sea. So all the elements going into the ocean, the salinity, what makes up the seafloor, the benthic layer, and seasonality plays into it, climate plays into it. At Oyster Master Guild, we have kind of identified the 3 key elements of merroir. So we like to say it's a combination, intersection of nature, time, and energy. Where nature does its thing, species, environment, genetics, time, seasons, number of years, number of days, and then finally the energy, which is the hard work that farmers will put into growing oysters. And it's a lot of work and it's a lot of choices that they have to make. And the history of that is it's not a linear history, but in the back in the days.
I remember those days.
Yeah, Patrick remembers, back in the 1600s, when all oysters were wild harvested, right? You didn't really have to do much other than just go out into the water, pick them up, just open them however you can and enjoy. Then we get into managed beds where it was sort of half wild, half farming. Long story short, now today, we primarily see farmers use intensive aquaculture methods. And by intensive, it really means cage culture, using some kind of container to hold your oysters in so that predators can't get to them, so that they don't get buried in the mud. But when I mean choices, these are the choices that every farm has to make. And these are the stages. We're not going to get into all of them, but I just wanted to show everyone how intense this process is. You first start with seed creation. Where are you getting your baby oysters? Either in a hatchery or you are collecting them in the wild. Prince Edward Island actually has wild spat collection still on the regular for the most part. You won't really see that anywhere else on the Atlantic coast, as far as I know, maybe the Chesapeake. Then the nursery, where baby oysters are protected from the outer conditions. Grow out is where the majority of time is pretty much spent. Are you putting them, depending on where you're growing, is it in a little basket? Is it suspended in like, you know, a lantern net, or is it in cages, or are you just broadcasting them on the sea floor? It all depends. I think I've been to, I don't know, several 60, 50 farms by now, and none of them are the same. Every single one is different. There's no cookie cutter oyster farm. So it's just kind of amazing how innovative, resourceful farmers are. Refinement, optional stage, but refinement is a really strategic process that some farmers choose to do to improve the taste and texture of their oysters. This is typically actually highlighted and celebrated in French oyster culture. Less done and talked about in North America, but we want to include that in there. And finally, harvesting and processing, where a lot of the work goes. And I guess throughout, like grow out, farmers are constantly pulling their oysters, grading them, and then putting them back into the water. So it's not just like, let's put these oysters in the water and here you go. There's a lot of grading and manicuring of them as well. And speaking of oyster grades, do you want to?
Okay, so with the different grades of oysters, if you are buying your oysters from a wholesaler, you'll hear of these other words called standards and choice. Have you heard of those who are buyers? Anyone buyers here? No, not yet. Soon, in a couple of years, you'll be buyers at the restaurant. So you're offered these things, sometimes standards or wilds, and then cultured or farm-raised oysters. Customers, they've always said this to me as well. I don't want a farm-raised oyster because it's like farm fish. You're feeding the oyster. No, we don't feed the oyster. We don't feed the fish. Farm-raised oysters create something that has a very consistent shape of shell. So you've got something that will look like this all the time. Out of a box of 100, you'll get about 99 and a half of them looking just like this.
I mean, good farms.
And on the good farms that work, and they take their time doing it.
Yeah.
So what you'll see in wholesalers or groceries, when you have a wild oyster, you'll get that. In Canada, we have this thing. It's like 33 oysters for 15 bucks. Now that's a wild oyster, and people bring them home and they go, they can't shuck them because their shape is weird or natural. They just don't, but they don't have that great oyster experience. You have to spend a few more bucks to get something like this.
Mm-hmm.
So you as a restaurateur or a chef, you think about what? Apart from the ingredients, you're going to get the best ingredients first. Two is the cost of the ingredients, your food cost. So if you're getting 33 oysters for 15 bucks, but you're really only getting about 20 of them out of the 33, it's not 15 bucks no more. It's now $21 when you can get these for 20. That type of idea. It's better to spend on a farm-raised oyster sometimes to get that shape of shell. Good question.
The legal ownership. So there's water leases that you have to get from the government. And I believe only Washington State, you can actually own your own water.
What?
Yeah.
Wow. Nobody owns the water.
I know. So it's done state by state, but all equipment and all that material that is owned by the oyster farm itself. Now, managed beds is a little bit different because you can also have scenarios where it's partly owned by the state, and then you have rights to work that site as a grower.
Yeah, usually it's a lease or a grant. In the states they're called grants. Up in Canada they're called leases, and it's just a government paperwork. You have to do a business plan. You got to give a 5-year plan of why you want to do it. So you pick your water that you want to do. Then there's a lot of testing that has to happen first before you can actually start doing it. But you get to you own your brand, you own everything else you do about it, and it's not like I don't think anyone can come and usurp you out of your space. There were oyster wars in the 1800s and stuff, but that's another story for another day. Was that pretty close, James? Good answer, James. He's like, yeah, whatever he said, that's fine. But yeah, that's usually what it is. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah.
So different grades is what you're going to see when you're buying your oysters. And so you can have a small, medium, large. In Europe, they go by the grams. So they have largers and smallers based on weights. Here we understand that sometimes brands just call themselves a brand, and that is what they're doing all the time. And if they grow a larger one, they'll call it something different. So you can get them in various different ones. So that's why we have to know about the different oysters. And if you're going to have someone who's employed at your oyster bar who knows how to buy, like an oyster sommelier, perhaps, they would know what size, grade, quality is going to come through when you're buying with different oysters at different times of year.
Now we get to good part.
Oh, we get the tasty thing?
You have to do the tasty thing.
Are we question? We love question.
They're like the first step that I guess the restaurant, like the bars and restaurants will typically buy from. Because the wild ones, you say that you can get like 20 out of 33.
It depends on the time of year. When I'm saying that type of thing as an experience going to the grocery store and getting that inexpensive box because it's price cost, right? And you want to get the best price for the restaurant when you're building up your ideas. It's going to get harder and harder now to get buckashuck as it goes because inflation, everything's going crazy, and the farmers have to farm and actually work on it. So when you're talking about that type of thing, you can get wilds. But sometimes the time of year, they're not readily available as well. So you have to kind of know when they are, when they're not, and working with your wholesaler, you got to know where they're coming from. And there's a whole bunch of different things and factors that come into it when you're buying. So for that, you'd have to, first thing I do when I talk to customers or restaurant owners is who's your wholesaler? And who's your wholesaler? And then we can take a look at their list and see what they have to create a nice list for your restaurant. And we'll go from there.
Okay.
So what we're showing today is lovely. It's an East Coast and a West Coast oyster. So we'll just put it like this. And we're going to taste oysters first. And then I'm going to show you how to shuck oysters. Yes, so grab a little plate. Take lots of pictures first, though. Right on.
Grab a plate. They should be.
So they're listed as they're pointing this side is west, that side is east. Okay. The smaller of the two and the darker, thank you, darker rim is going to be the West Coast oyster. There you go. Slide it in. And there you go. Pass her down.
You can go
It's
back
like Thanksgiving. Yeah, you will. You're sitting down now. Here you go. Try some of those.
Wow.
So the smaller of the two, I'll do a description, is the West Coast.
This thing?
And the larger of the two is the East Coast. And I'll tell you which brand they are in a second or two as well. Yeah, I'm going to walk through that.
No, actually, 33books.com.
Nope.
33.
Delish.
Mhm.
You want an oyster? Super. Everyone got?
Did you say me?
Yay. Napkins. Now we're getting fancy. That's a fancy restaurant.
What
I
is
had,
this called?
so what you have here
No, but what is it?
on your little plate, you can sort of see it here. There's a smaller and a larger. The smaller one has a darker gill around the outside. So it's what I call sometimes eyelashes. It should be a little bit darker on the outside, like that one, comparatively speaking. And the other one is sort of that classic creamy 50 shades of beige type of moment going on. So the larger of the two is your East Coast oyster. This is a raspberry point oyster, lovingly grown by that young fella right over there, James Power. And the other one is the West Coast oyster. So you have two species here. Okay, the West Coast is called a cushy oyster from glorious British Columbia. That way, I can smell it right here, right now.
No.
Nose first. So thinking about the senses, looking at the oyster first, I got to say they're very well done, nicely shucked, nice teardrop shape. And I'm going to say, you know, Cushy's got that classic. They're tumbled and tumbled and tumbled to get this deep cup. And you're going to have a very deep textural cup as well. But you can see with the raspberry point oyster, you've got a nice large adductor muscle on this one and a great teardrop shape to the shell as well. Heavy. You can feel the heavy, the density on that shell, as well as the meat. Right now, this quality is coming up. This is what's known as oyster season. November is when the oysters, we'll talk about that in a second or two. But what we're going to do is you taste your oyster. First off, I would do nose first, you know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I ate mine already.
I know everything is done. Sometimes you got to make sure the oyster is shucked perfectly. That's good. So what I do is a quick nose of the oyster, and then you slide in and chew it up. You're loving it, aren't you? Great. Oyster virgins in the house. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of them here. So you chew it up. You get a texture to it. You got that toothsomeness. Nice meaty oyster there, James. I'm getting a little bit of a sweet and then salt. Sometimes you expect salt first. Not going to happen. Sometimes it's going to be sweet salt and go through that. Then you get this, I'm getting a little bit of earthiness or a mushroom in the finish of this one, which is nice. It's light. That's your umami coming through on that type of thing. And that's the classic East Coast oyster. Salt and sweet, various different ranges of that, depending on where it comes from. The next oyster here, again, the first oyster being an East Coast is called a Chrysostea virginicus oyster. So that's a classic East Coast species, same species from all the way up in Newfoundland, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and beyond.
It kind of tastes like shiitake mushroom to me.
Yeah.
The finish.
I got a good story about the shiitake mushroom for the chefs it's 1985. And a customer asked, what the heck is this? Cake mushroom. They're reading this. What's a cake mushroom? And even as a 60-year-old kid, I go, that's shiitake. It's not cake mushroom. Anywho, the next oyster is going to be a little bit different. It's floral on the nose.
Mm.
You've got this sort of sweet, oceany type of nose to it. And what you're going to find when you eat it up.
I think this is a different species as well, the Magellana gigas. You might actually see Chrysostea gigas in a lot of documents because scientists decided to put it in its own genus.
Yay, science!
Yeah, relatively recently.
Well,
yeah, relatively.
This one, you go. What do you think of this one?
I think this is higher salinity at this point, although as very point typically is
a lot saltier.
A lot saltier than what apparently
this is subtly saltier.
Yeah. But this is it's indicative oyster. It's indicative Pacific oyster because of this like distinct vegetal note that comes forward immediately. And a lot of times the kushis will take on this really nice celery salt or cucumber, watermelon rind type of flavor. And it's just a really nice texture because of the tumbling as well. And we say tumbling a lot. Tumbling comes up quite a lot in oyster jargon. It's mechanism that can be done by the tides, by hand, or by machinery. And what it's doing is essentially jostling the oyster around so that the outer edge of the shell chips off and the oyster's just like swearing and building building the muscle a bit stronger. And instead of growing the shell out, it grows up and stronger. So tumbled oysters typically are the thing to do in a lot of farms right now, but it gives you this really lovely shape. If this was kind of cultured on the beach and sort of let loose, it would be very frilly, right? So right now it's very smooth because of that tumbling method.
These come from a rack-grown oyster, and then you can see the pitted scars where you see the dark color, and then there's this white part that just looks like a broken ceramic. That's where the frill got broken off. So the more you do that, the deeper the cup, the harder it's going to get to. This is a very hard shell for this species. The raspberry point, I got to say, this is like, alabaster. This thing is crazy strong right now, and it's really, really thick. So how often do you tumble it? So they're moving around in the ocean anyways when they're on the floats and in the little bags, but tumbling is a physical thing where the farmers bring the bag out, put them through it used to be like a cement mixer, but now it's like a tube. There's other different methods that they do. Some of them are now just tumbling it in the bag. There's the guys in Ireland who got that thing. They just tumble it right on the bag on the beach type of thing, but it moves them around. That's what you want to do to grow that great shell type of thing. Now, what do you do with your shells when you're done? The darker, the smaller one is, if you look at your shells, the darker one is the cushy oyster coming from British Columbia. That's your Megalana gigas oyster. Right. And that's got the more floral notes, I find. And everyone is different. Everyone's got their own palate, right? But generally speaking, we can suggest that it's got a little bit of a floral, very vegetal note. Sometimes sweet cream, melon, cucumber is what your West Coast oyster is generally going to have. And then salty sweet is what you're going to have from the East Coast oysters. But then there's different notes that come from the different regions that are specific. And that's what you get in the two different types, which is a lovely way to taste them out.
So later on, we're actually going to only have the East Coast oyster, but the different farms, and you will be able to compare side by side how they're the same or how they're very different from each other by size, shape, texture, all that stuff. So now you're gonna do a shucking.
Might do a demo, a shucking demo. Who's got questions right now? Anyone?
Yeah. Yes. Oh.
Do you want that or do I get that?
Yes, so the myth and the saying goes you shouldn't eat oysters in months without an R. Is that how it goes? Yeah, you should not. So this has a long history and it refuses to die.
Right.
The R rule, as we like to say, well, first of all, oysters, yes, they do have seasonality in the sense that oysters do taste better to us in some times of the year than others. And those months will vary depending on where you are located in the world. But typically when winter comes, the oysters that have gorged on their food all summer and fall fatten up, and then they store their energy in the form of glycogen. So it makes the oyster taste sweeter. That said, in the summertime, now where it used to come from was back in the 1500s in England, when they had their native oyster beds, the oysters would be reproducing in the summertime. When waters warm up, they're spawning. And that is kind of when their population was like, we're just not going to eat oysters because it's a sustainability thing. And also it's a actually appetizing thing, because the long story short, the way that those oysters reproduce is a little bit different. They have a different strategy than the oysters grown here. The mother oyster actually holds its young in the oyster itself versus so
that's the Austera family. So when you saw the 5 species, the 3 of them on this side is the Crassostria and the Megalana. Then the Austera on this side, which is Austria, sorry, the European flat oysters out of Maine, and then the Olympia oysters. The female holds its young in its gills, so it looks like silk, but it's actually like little caviar. So if you take that oyster out in that season and eat it, you're eating 30 million little oysters. You don't get new oysters next year.
Yeah.
So that's where in the 1500s they knew about this. In England, when we're talking about the English oyster at that point in time, was that Austera edulis species of oyster, and it holds its young in its gill. Over here, our oysters spawn out broadcast spawning. They get thin. They get a little milky sometimes. If we won't even get into the diploids and triploids, but you can eat them still within that time frame. So from the 1500s, there was other things as well. Transportation, refrigeration didn't really work very well. So yeah, the idea was to allow that season to happen. So, and that's up in the northern hemisphere. So it would be May, June, July, and August are those months without an R that allows those oysters to reproduce. But it doesn't really hold true. Now with global warming, yes, there are things that you have to listen to. Warmer waters, you have things that sometimes you can't harvest when there's different things going on in the water. Red tide or something that comes up, it's not toxic to the oysters, but it's toxic to humans to eat. There's times when they're going to be warning you not to eat oysters from a specific region. It's not all oysters. Canadian oysters in cold water or icebound regions deal with colder water, so you can get great oysters from that region all year long. Sometimes the texture, we do have 4 seasons that I've noticed when we talk about these oysters that deal with ice. There will be textural differences throughout the year. There'll be salinity differences as well. I find a deep winter oyster, when they deal with ice, poor James has to cut through 6 feet of ice in the wintertime to get to the oysters in January, February. Probably not this year, because it's going to be a little on the warm side. But when they cut through the ice, a lot of the fresh water is frozen at the top. It concentrates the seawater that's underneath that the oysters are into. So I find them get this big sort of robust saltiness to it in the deeper water, deeper winter. So we can have different flavors of oysters all year long, but you can get great oysters all year long, not adhering to that months without an R. So therefore, we're changing the calendar to May, June, July, and August. Let's just throw an R, throw the R in there anytime. Throw it in there anytime we can do that. So while we are continuing, am I doing the demo now, the Shucky demo? And then we have the cooked oysters are coming up as well. You can cook with oysters. So, okay, oyster virgins here. We had the first timer, and you are the okay. You're okay, and you actually had a preference. You like the two, well, one of the two. The dark one, the West Coast oyster. Why was that? Interesting. I like that. Cool. That's all right. Yep, that can be. Some people, especially when I find folks travel into my oyster bar and they say, wow, these oysters are really salty. And I'm like, where are you from? And they'll say, well, I'm from Georgia, or I'm from Alabama or Texas, in the southern states where they're used to something not quite so salty. And that's where they grew up on tasting those oysters. And they said they yell at me for putting salt on the oyster. I'm like, no, it's not me, Mother Nature. What did you think of your oyster? Okay, I think you two should fight then. We got an East Coast and a West Coast fight. No, everyone, you can like your own oysters. That's great. And you don't have to choose a preference, but you can notice the difference. That's the main thing. And do you think now you would go out and celebrate, not to go and buy a dozen oysters tomorrow, but maybe, you know, with your friends might have one or two. Yeah, you wouldn't shun it away or run away or anything. Wait till you try the cooked oysters. We're doing some cooked oysters in a second. We're going to do a little bit of demo. It's kind of hard to see everything, so we're going to do a little bit one here, and then when we're over here shucking and tasting, you can get a little bit closer and hands-on for those who actually want to learn how to shuck oysters and are training for this as chefs and all. These are the lovely little Beausoleil oysters. As you can see, and I'll go through this real quick, the anatomy-wise, teardrop shape. There's a pointy part and a roundy part. The pointy part's the hinge. That's where we've said on the picture there. That's where the oyster stays open and its elastic hinge opens it up this way in the ocean. So it has a muscle on the inside. When you have the teardrop shape, when I'm right-handed, any left-handed people? You can go sit outside with the other people. So no, that's okay. That's the correct way. I'm teaching the backwards way of shucking oysters as a right-handed person. So I keep my oyster knife in my hand at all times. So whether I'm picking oysters up or putting them down, I do not at work put my oyster knife down. When I finish the plate, then I will put it down. Keep it on the thing, don't drop it on the floor. You all know about public health and all that type of stuff and dealing with your knives. Hinge, pointy part. I like to shuck through the hinge. In Toronto, I don't have any local oysters. So I got very good at importing all 5 species, everything that I could get. So I needed to have one technique that would open 5 different species of oysters in the amount of time that my customers demanded me. That's why you get bigger, better, and faster, because they want to get them out in less than 15 to 20 minutes, if possible. You know, usually on a busy night, it would take about 30 minutes to get an order of oysters that came out. That's a longer story as it is. But my technique through the hinge would work on all different species. If you talk to local people from various different areas, they'll say there are bill shuckers down in Chesapeake Bay. There's a specific reason why they do that, because there's a sponge that hangs out in the area that basically sits on the hinge. If you try to hinge shut, it explodes. So Chesapeake Bay oyster or James River oyster, you want to go in through the bill. But that's where you're going to learn how to read the oyster. Again, when you're buying your oysters, you want to know what your level is of shucking. So when you learn that, then you work on your style and technique. Me personally, I am a hinge shucker, so I'm going to move this out of the way for a sec. So I put my fresh oysters on this side, my finishing plate on this side. No, I don't generally use a cast iron stub lid, although it's a really good idea. Lovely little rim. Cast iron freezes well and holds temperature very well. So you could use that. That would actually look really good. The cast iron and the shell would pop visualize. I think that's not a bad idea. If you've ever wanted to know what to do with the lids, you can do something like that now. And it holds, look at the handle. Anyways, I digress. So right-handed, I'm going to pick up the oyster then with my knife hand. I'm going to place it on my deck. This is a tray system that I use and I shuck on. I shuck on this little thing here. It used to be, what do you think this was? A hockey puck. Used to be a Canadian hockey puck. Come on. This one's made out of wood. You can see how it's worn away because shucking a good 100,000 oysters or so will do that to wood. So it puts this grip down so I can hold on to it. Yes, I have a fancy glove. I highly recommend fancy gloves after three times putting the knife right through my hand. So now use this and it's a lot better, safer. What really this does, it allows me to grip the oyster very, very well. More force on this means less force on this. So whether you have a fancy glove or you're using a cloth, I would use a wet cloth. Anyways, I'll show you later. Wet cloth, fold it up, cover your oyster so it doesn't move. Too loose. I want you to hold it like you mean it, so it doesn't wobble around at all. Zero movement if you're going to be doing this. If the table wobbles, that's another thing. Try not to shuck on cruisers. Look at this thing. It's like I'm driving a bus. So I'll hold on to this for dear life and slippery stuff. So I'm coming from this side, fresh to service. Okay, so I work in a system like this. It's like when you're doing plating for large groups of people, you got the conveyor belt thing. This is the system. Pickup comes down here, so hands are over here. Fresh stuff comes over here, and you put your orders on this side with the chits and all that. That's why you stay in one spot, and all you do is this. Move it around. So this hand, two hands do two separate things in my style of technique. So I will pick up the oyster, place it. I'm going to hold it with my oyster hand into the hinge, which is that pointy part. It's got a lovely little hole in these oysters that you can actually see where you're going to put your knife tip. And you want to take your oyster knife and you want to turn it like a key in a lock. You don't want to pry it. You don't want to jab it. You don't want to stab it. Key in a lock turning. You're rotating the blade around, you're rotating the knife around the blade axis, and it torques, it turns and pries open the oyster with very little force. The beautiful thing about this handle, the way it's angled, I'm actually using this like a fulcrum to open it up. Anyways, in the hinge, I give it a little wiggle till it sets. And it's a quarter turn, it's popped open. So then I pry it open at this point. I'll hold it open with my index finger so that I can see down to where the muscle is attached. If you're closer, and we'll do it over there, you can see where it's attached. So I'll come across, scrape that, release the top shell. I will then turn the oyster, look for grit, which is the first thing that's going to happen. You're going to pop a little bit of grit through the hinge, or maybe some new shell growth. Back when we were talking about the mantle and nacre making the actual shell, the new shell growth will happen on the outside rim, so you want to sweep that out as well. Now I'm looking at where the adductor muscle is, that round button. That's the only spot I need to shuck. I don't have to go over here. I don't have to come around here. I have to look where it is right here, and I see it, and it's a hard scrape push. I'm not trying to slice underneath. I'm not trying to slice salmon and sashimi. I'm trying to scrape this off the shell. Did you hear that? That's steel against shell in a 90-degree angle push. And when you push it, you're going to see this. I'm going to just jab this for a second. You're going to see that black spot. That's the insertion point where the muscle inserts into the bone. All of your bones have muscles that insert into them. That scar there is where the adductor muscle holds onto the bottom shell. That's the only place you have to do that. And then you butter back. Butter back is a term from one of the growers in Ireland where if you mushed up the oyster a bit, spread it back to make it look nice, and place it there. While I'm placing, this hand is doing nothing. Now it's doing something. Place, pick up the next one. In the hinge, pop it, up, round, cut the top off, turn, hit bottom, back, and get the next one. That's how you train your hands to do two different things. I'll watch shuckers. I'll watch them go, and when they do this, you're wasting time. Now, that's in a competition type of contest, but every Friday night shift, you're in a competition to get that oyster out as fast as the customers are asking for you. Always keep your eyes on the oyster when you are entering the hinge. That's where you have to look at it most, right here. Because if you take your eyes off here, this goes through and goes boink like this if you don't wear the fancy glove and matching underpants. Don't talk about that. Because that one came out, right? That was oh, sorry. So that's what you want to do when you're shucking oysters. So fresh to service in a motion. Lefties are the correct way, sorry. Not backwards, I'm backwards, I know. So fresh on this side, pick, place, shuck, finish it, go and finish. Then you want to do your lemons. You don't have to cut your lemons ahead of time. Your mise en place, get ready. You can cut maybe 1 or 2 lemons ahead if you have a second or two, because what happens with lemon when it puts into a bowl? The acid macerates the outer lemon, what is the shell, the pith, the skin, gets soft and mushy, no nice. I fresh cut for 20 years. I fresh cut my lemons to order. And I will make 8 wedges. If I want to do a wedge, I'll tip my lemons so they're squared, and you cut it into 4 cuts. So you get 8 wedges out of a lemon, technically. The squared ends allows the consumer to actually squish it without it slipping out and poking them in the eye. If you leave the tips on, it'll get a little slippery. What do you do with your lemon tips? Soak them in vodka. You now have limoncello. Food waste. Think about it. We all talk about it, chefs, don't we? All right. Then we put it out here. Generally, I'll do a couple of lemons, make it look nice. And we do fresh horseradish up in Canada and Toronto. That's our style. There's fresh and or pickled horseradish usually that goes on it as a garnish. And then there's your sauces or whatever else you want to put onto that as well. What do you do with your bottom shells? Once this is consumed, that's a ramekin. Everyone knows what ramekins are, yeah? When you own your own restaurant, the first thing you're going to do when you go to your kitchen, you're going to look in the garbage. You're going to find what? Ramekins and oyster forks and other things as well. So you don't want them to end up there, but they do end up there, unfortunately. So let's use them. Again, food waste, upcycling concept. It's a carbon catcher. The shell is actually a great carbon catcher for sustainability. Not only do they filter feed, but they also capture carbon and sink them in the shells. So we want to keep them, use them, do some stuff with them, and it all works. That's how you shuck oysters. And when you're shucking, if you're at home, you're doing some stuff you can shuck ahead of time. You want to shuck fresh to order as much as possible. But if you're going to do a catering where 50 people are going to come in and they're going to hit you all at once, you pre-shuck. If you have a little oyster bed or something with ice, I would load that thing up with maybe about 100 oysters and then stay on top of the next 800 that I have to shuck for the catering gig. And just keep it going. Keep a good 50, 20 or whatever. It depends how people eat them. You know all about shucking that. Yeah. So that's how I shuck and present. And we'll do a little bit more close up over there. Does anyone have any questions? Service questions? Shells are compostable. If you don't recycle them or upcycle them, you can compost them. If there's no compost in your restaurant, fix it. Make compost, get it done. And then you can build with this. You can do all types of stuff.
So I think we're wrapping up. And last, if I can get this to work.
This is actually really nice. I like this question. Right. Yep. Hampton Bay is Long Island, yeah? Okay, it's sure. It's one of the icebound regions. So icebound region is the way I consider an icebound region is from about Jersey north, is if they deal with ice that comes in. So they deal with cold water in the winter. So depending again on the oyster, so if it's the East Coast icebound region, that's up to about 4 weeks out of water. Yes. So you can, because they deal with winter, they deal with ice. So when they deal with ice in those regions, they inherently over 5 years, that's why they take 5 years to grow and 12 months down in the Gulf of Mexico. Same species, different growing region gives you a different time frame to market. So they understand what cold is. So when you take that oyster and put it in the fridge, they go, hibernation time, going to sleep. You take a warm body water oyster and you put it in the fridge, you'll get less time on it. I've been to Singapore before. We get Malaysian oysters. If you put them in the fridge, they open up within a day. They said, I don't know what this is. Yeah, and I'm done. Same thing with Dibba.
Yeah.
The grower at Dibba Bay says his oysters hold way better at 10 to 12 degrees than they do at 0 to 3. you know, fridge temperature. They would do way better at cool temperature like a wine. So it depends on the region. But yeah, this is why these oysters, if you think about the Canadian oysters that we're bringing and showcasing you here, the Hampton Bay oysters, those things, yeah, sure, let's bring them out. Those ones will last about 4 weeks. Now, do you want to have to sit on oysters for 4 weeks in your fridge, chefs?
No.
No, we're not buying pets. We're wanting to move these things, right? Right. So the idea is, you know, if you want to get your best price, you call James up and go, give me an 18-wheeler of oysters. And James like, cool, no problem. But you're going to have to store them for a long time unless you got your volume. That's why you deal with wholesalers. It's hard to go directly to all the growers, depending on where you live, what you want to do. But when you're doing that type of thing, it's the dance. It's you got to figure out your rotation, FIFO, right? First in, first out. Got to know your numbers, and you do your counts at the end of the night. So you got, you know, when you're working the bar, you count them all off. And now we're serving cooked oysters.
We're serving cooked oysters, and then if you have any other questions, we'll take them during the panel.
Oh, right,
And
yeah.
so just to wrap this section up, we want to tell you a little bit about Oyster Master Guild. So we are a group, an international network, I think like 140 of us now, who really celebrate oyster appreciation. Actually, guys want to raise your hands? We have a couple OMG members here. Woohoo! So please ask them about the new course. If you thought this was interesting and you want to get more into the nitty-gritty of oyster appreciation, there is a level 1 course that we offer online. It has 6 modules, all done self-guided. There's videos organized by different sections, quizzes, and once you take this course and you pass the exam, you can become a certified level 1 oyster ambassador, which is pretty cool. And you get a nifty pin that was handmade by me. And for all you guys, we really appreciate your time and the opportunity to do this. So if you are interested, we have a QR code that sets you up with 10% off the course. And yeah, and then you're welcome to ask any questions about OMG on the panel as well. So
What you're tasting now, it's a caramelized.
Oh,
oh yeah, what
You can speak about that recipe. We're gonna.
I just see a bunch of shells. I don't even know. I think and they got the recipes as well. So oysters cook well. So a lot of people will have oysters cooked first before they will actually have them raw. They fry very well. Oyster po' boy. I had this wicked good sandwich in Mexico City last weekend, almost like a grilled cheese where the bread was just buttered and then plancha. They had the little cheese and then fried oysters inside. Oy vey, it was so good. So this is I believe I did a caramelized bourbon onion combination. You can make compound butters for days, whatever you want to do. Make a compound butter, make a little log, cut a little pad off of it, shuck your oyster. I sometimes like to leave it attached to the bottom shell when I'm going to cook them or roast them so they don't slide out into the grill or something like that. So they stay in the thing. Add that pad of compound butter, throw it in the salamander, throw it in the oven, use the barbecue till that butter is bubbling away. And the oyster's cooked when the gills ruffle like that 1972 tuxedo that you used to wear. Well, no, not me. I heard back then in those days, you used to wear tuxedo shirts like that. So yeah, that's when you know the oyster's cooked, and you can use them. But when you're using cooking with oysters, use something a little bit bigger that can handle the heat as well.
Okay.
Really informative, right? It's wonderful.